The autumn rain had settled gently over Nashville, washing the city streets in silver reflections as neon signs shimmered against the wet pavement. Music Row was quieter than usual. Most recording sessions had already ended for the evening, but one studio remained brightly lit long after sunset. Inside RCA Studio B, musicians whispered instead of laughed. No one seemed eager to break the silence. They all knew Elvis Presley had arrived earlier than expected. That alone wasn't unusual. Elvis often preferred spending time inside a recording studio when the world outside became too loud. Fame had surrounded him for years, yet the studio still felt like the only place where nobody expected him to smile simply because he was Elvis Presley. Tonight was different. No reporters had been invited, no photographers waited outside, no record executives were planning a publicity stunt. Only a handful of trusted musicians, engineers, and close friends had gathered to rehearse several gospel arrangements before Elvis's upcoming performances. The room smelled of warm tube amplifiers, polished wood, fresh coffee, and old sheet music. Elvis sat alone beside the grand piano. He wasn't wearing one of his famous stage jumpsuits. Instead, he wore a simple black shirt beneath a dark jacket, the sleeves rolled back just enough to reveal tired hands resting quietly on his knees. He stared across the empty studio floor. Not at anyone, at something much farther away. Charlie Hodge, who had spent years working beside Elvis, quietly placed a cup of coffee near him. "You've hardly spoken all afternoon." Elvis smiled faintly. "I'm listening." Charlie looked around. "To what?" Elvis slowly glanced toward the ceiling. "The room." Charlie laughed softly. "The room isn't saying much." Elvis answered almost immediately. "It always does." Across the studio, several musicians continued tuning guitars. A Hammond organ hummed gently. Someone tested a snare drum with careful taps. Every sound echoed warmly through the famous recording room. Elvis closed his eyes. "This place remembers everybody." No one responded, because somehow they understood exactly what he meant. Outside, another car pulled into the parking lot. A battered, dark sedan stopped beside the entrance. The driver stepped out wearing worn boots, faded jeans, and long hair tucked beneath a weathered cowboy hat. Willie Nelson. At 39 years old, Willie was already respected throughout Nashville as one of the city's finest songwriters, though he had not yet become the global icon history would later remember. He carried an old acoustic guitar case with one hand, while pulling his jacket tighter against the rain with the other. Inside the lobby, the receptionist smiled. "They're already waiting." Willie nodded. "I figured Elvis would get here before everyone." "He did," Willie chuckled. "He usually does." As he entered the studio, conversations briefly paused. Elvis looked up. A grin spread across his face. "There he is," Willie smiled. "I heard somebody promised coffee." Elvis pointed toward the table. "Help yourself before the musicians drink all of it." The tension immediately softened. Within minutes they were laughing together, exchanging stories about endless tours, sleepless nights, forgotten lyrics, and impossible audiences. To anyone watching, they looked less like famous musicians and more like old friends who understood a life few others could imagine. Near the control room stood another visitor. Unlike everyone else, he hadn't touched an instrument. He carried a leather notebook filled with handwritten observations. His name was Leonard Brooks, one of Nashville's most influential music columnists. Leonard had built a reputation over 20 years by writing brutally honest reviews. Artists feared him. Record labels respected him. Readers believed every word he printed. He crossed his arms while quietly observing Elvis. After nearly 20 minutes, Leonard finally spoke. "I've always wondered something." The room slowly became silent. Elvis turned politely. "What's that?" Leonard adjusted his glasses. "People keep saying nobody sings Heartbreak like you." Elvis simply nodded. "I've heard that," Leonard continued, "but I've never been sure whether they're listening to your voice," he paused, "or your reputation." Nobody moved. Even Willie stopped pouring coffee. Leonard wasn't finished. "There's a difference between sounding emotional," he looked directly into Elvis's eyes, "and actually knowing pain." The room suddenly felt colder. Charlie shifted uneasily. Several musicians exchanged uncomfortable glances. Everyone knew Leonard enjoyed asking difficult questions, but this felt different. This wasn't curiosity. This was a challenge. Elvis remained calm. "What makes you ask?" Leonard walked a little closer. "You've lived surrounded by applause." Another step. "Private airplanes." Another. "Luxury." He folded his notebook. "So, tell me," his voice became almost conversational, "if you truly understand heartbreak," he looked around the studio, "prove it." No orchestra, no audience, no stage lights. Just your voice. Sing something that doesn't depend on fame. Silence. The challenge hung in the room like thunder, waiting to break. Charlie looked ready to interrupt. Instead, Elvis quietly stood. Not angrily, not proudly. Simply stood. He walked toward the piano without saying a single word. His fingers rested lightly on the polished wood. Then he stopped. He didn't play. He looked back toward Leonard. "I don't sing to prove anything." No bitterness, no sarcasm, just truth. Leonard smiled. Convenient answer. Before anyone else could respond, the studio door opened again. A deep, familiar voice drifted across the room. "I think that's enough." Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway, rein still clinging to the shoulders of his long black coat, was Johnny Cash. The room immediately grew still. Cash removed his hat slowly. He wasn't scheduled to be there. No one expected him. Yet, somehow, his arrival felt almost inevitable. He looked first at Elvis, then at Willie, finally at Leonard. Johnny stepped inside without hurry. Each footstep echoed softly across the hardwood floor. I heard voices all the way down the hallway. Charlie smiled. "You picked quite a night to visit." Johnny answered quietly, "Maybe." Then his eyes settled firmly on Leonard. "But it sounds like somebody's confusing performance with truth." Leonard didn't seem intimidated. "I simply asked him to prove that his songs come from real experience." Johnny's expression never changed. "You don't ask a man to prove scars." Leonard folded his arms. "Why not?" Johnny stopped only a few feet away. "Because the people asking usually don't recognize them anyway." No one breathed. The room had transformed from a rehearsal into something else entirely. Something personal, something impossible to predict. Johnny walked over beside Elvis. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Years of mutual respect required no introduction. Finally, Johnny placed one hand gently against the piano. "You planning to sing?" Elvis smiled faintly. "I was." Johnny nodded. "Good." Leonard interrupted. "So he'll accept the challenge?" Johnny looked directly at him. No. The columnist frowned. No? Johnny shook his head. He won't sing because you asked. A long pause followed. He'll sing because somebody else in this room needs to hear it. Those words landed differently. Even Leonard seemed uncertain how to answer. Across the studio, Willie slowly lowered his coffee cup. His eyes remained fixed on Elvis. Something had shifted. Nobody could explain exactly what, only that the atmosphere had grown heavier, more intimate, as though every person standing inside RCA Studio B had unknowingly become part of a night they would remember for the rest of their lives. Outside, the rain continued falling. Inside, no one realized another visitor had quietly entered through the rear hallway. He wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. Most people inside the room had never seen him before. He wore a maintenance uniform, carried a toolbox, and paused silently near the back wall, hoping not to disturb the rehearsal. What nobody noticed, except Elvis, was that the elderly man's hands were trembling, and in those trembling hands he clutched a faded photograph that had clearly been folded and unfolded hundreds of times. Elvis stared at the picture from across the room. He couldn't see the face in it, but somehow he already knew the man hadn't come there to fix anything. He had come carrying a heartbreak no song could ever fully explain. And before the night was over, that photograph would change every person standing inside the studio. The old maintenance worker stood perfectly still near the back wall, almost hoping no one would notice him. Yet Elvis had. There was something haunting about the man's posture. He wasn't standing like someone waiting to repair a broken light fixture or tighten a loose cable. His shoulders carried a different kind of weight, the kind that couldn't be lifted with tools. The studio lights reflected softly against the silver edges of his hair. His work uniform was clean, but faded from years of use. A small stitched name above his pocket simply read, Thomas. Nothing more. No one said a word. Finally, Charlie Hodge approached him. "Sir, can we help you?" Thomas looked startled, almost embarrassed that everyone had turned toward him. "I'm sorry." His voice trembled. "I didn't mean to interrupt." He lifted the toolbox slightly. "They told me one of the hallway lights needed replacing." Charlie glanced toward one of the engineers. The engineer nodded. "That's right." Charlie smiled warmly. "Take your time." Thomas nodded gratefully. But instead of walking toward the hallway, he hesitated. His eyes drifted toward Elvis, then toward the piano, then back to the old photograph still resting inside his weathered hand. Elvis quietly stepped away from the piano. "You've got something on your mind." The room became silent again. Thomas lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Presley." "It's Elvis." Thomas swallowed. "I never expected to meet you." Elvis smiled gently. "Funny thing is," he glanced toward Johnny Cash, "none of us ever expect the nights we remember most." A few soft chuckles eased the tension. Thomas slowly unfolded the worn photograph. Its edges were cracked from years of being carried inside a wallet. He looked down at it before speaking. "My wife." Nobody interrupted. "We were married 42 years. His thumb rested carefully over the faded image. "She passed away 6 months ago." Silence. Not uncomfortable, respectful. Thomas continued. "She loved gospel music." His voice almost disappeared. "Especially yours." He looked toward Elvis again. "Every Sunday morning she'd put one of your records on before breakfast." He laughed quietly through tears. "Didn't matter whether I wanted to hear it or not." A few musicians smiled. Thomas smiled too. only for a second. Then it vanished. "I haven't played one since she died." The sentence seemed to linger inside the room. Even Leonard Brooks slowly lowered his notebook. For the first time that evening, he wasn't searching for a headline. He was simply listening. Elvis walked closer, not like a celebrity greeting a fan, like one man approaching another who had lost something precious. What was her name? Thomas looked down. Margaret. A beautiful name. It fit her. Thomas smiled again. She had the kind of laugh that made every room feel smaller. Johnny Cash quietly nodded. "I know that feeling." Thomas looked toward Johnny. "My wife loved your records, too," Johnny answered softly. "Then she had good taste." The room laughed gently. For a brief moment, grief made space for warmth. Then Thomas carefully handed the photograph to Elvis. "I don't know why I brought this tonight." Elvis accepted it with both hands. The black and white picture showed a young couple standing beside a pickup truck sometime in the early 1940s. Margaret was laughing directly at the camera. Thomas wasn't. He was looking at her, completely unaware the picture was even being taken. Elvis stared for several seconds, then quietly whispered, "That's love." Thomas blinked. "What?" Elvis pointed toward the photograph. She looked at the camera. He smiled. "You looked at her." Thomas's eyes filled immediately. "I never noticed that." Johnny leaned closer. "Neither did you because you were too busy living it." No one spoke after that. Some truths don't need explaining. Across the room, Leonard Brooks shifted uncomfortably. Everything about the evening had changed. Only half an hour earlier he had wanted to challenge Elvis. Now the challenge itself seemed strangely meaningless. Still, his pride wouldn't let him remain silent. He cleared his throat. "So," everyone looked toward him, "you've all shared beautiful stories." He looked directly at Elvis again. "But stories aren't songs." The atmosphere tightened. Leonard continued. "Real music doesn't happen during conversations." He folded his notebook. "It happens when someone opens their soul." Johnny sighed quietly. "You still don't understand." "I understand perfectly." "No." Johnny shook his head. "You understand records." A pause. "You understand reviews." Another. "You understand applause." He looked around the room. "But you've never understood silence." Leonard frowned. "What does that even mean?" Johnny walked toward the empty microphone. "It means," he rested one hand on the stand, "the greatest songs begin long before the first note." Willie Nelson had remained unusually quiet all evening. He now stepped forward, carrying his old acoustic guitar. "I've been thinking." Elvis smiled. "Dangerous habit." Willie laughed. "It usually is." He looked toward Thomas. "My daddy used to tell me something." Everyone listened. He said, "Every broken heart carries its own rhythm." Thomas nodded slowly. "I think he's right." Willie continued. "The hard part isn't writing music." He gently touched the guitar strings. "It's finding the courage to let someone hear it." Thomas whispered, "I don't think I have that courage anymore." Elvis looked directly into his eyes. "What happened after Margaret passed?" Thomas hesitated, then answered honestly, "I stopped singing." No one expected the words to hurt so much. "I stopped going to church. I stopped fishing. I stopped fixing the old porch she'd always wanted painted." He smiled sadly. "I even stopped talking much," his voice cracked, "because every conversation somehow reminded me she wasn't there." Charlie quietly looked away. Several musicians wiped their eyes. Thomas continued, "The house is so quiet now." He closed his eyes. "I've started leaving the television on at night." Nobody interrupted. "Not because I watch it." He shook his head. "I just can't stand hearing silence." Johnny slowly lowered his head, because he understood. Better than most. Elvis carefully returned the photograph. Then he asked a question no one expected. "When was the last time you heard her laugh?" Thomas looked confused. "What?" "In your mind." Thomas stared into space. His breathing slowed. "Yesterday." Elvis smiled gently. "And?" Thomas's eyes became distant. "I remembered her burning biscuits." Several people laughed softly. Thomas laughed too. "She couldn't cook breakfast to save her life." Johnny grinned. "Now that's a miracle." Everyone chuckled. Thomas continued, "But she'd sing while she cooked." His smile grew wider. "She always sang louder when she knew the biscuits were burning." The room erupted into warm laughter. For the first time since entering the studio, Thomas looked alive. Elvis quietly noticed it. "So," he asked, "maybe silence isn't what you're hearing?" Thomas frowned. "I don't understand." Elvis stepped beside him. "I think you're hearing memories." The words settled deep. "There's a difference." Thomas looked at the photograph again. "I've been trying so hard not to remember." Elvis nodded. "That's the problem." Thomas looked up. "You don't heal by running away from memories." A long pause followed. "You heal when you're finally strong enough to walk back into them." No one moved. Even Leonard Brooks stood completely still. He had spent decades reviewing songs, yet somehow he had never heard words like these. Outside, the rain finally began to slow. Inside the studio, one of the engineers quietly dimmed several overhead lights. Only the piano lamp remained brightly glowing. The room suddenly felt less like a recording studio and more like an old church after evening service. Johnny looked toward Elvis. "You ready?" Elvis looked back. "Almost." He glanced once more at Thomas. "What was Margaret's favorite hymn?" Thomas answered without hesitation. "How Great Thou Art." Several musicians exchanged knowing smiles. Of course it was. Elvis slowly sat at the grand piano. His fingers rested above the keys but did not press them. Not yet. No orchestra waited behind him. No audience expected a performance. No cameras rolled. No producer counted down from 5. There was only one grieving husband, one quiet room, and a song that suddenly meant far more than anyone had imagined. Then, just as Elvis inhaled to begin the first note, the studio telephone rang sharply from the control room. Its piercing sound shattered the silence. Everyone turned. The engineer answered. His face changed almost instantly. He covered the receiver and looked toward Johnny Cash. "Johnny." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "It's from Hendersonville." Johnny's expression froze. There was only one person who would call the studio from Hendersonville this late at night. His wife, June Carter Cash. And judging by the look on the engineer's face, something had gone terribly wrong. The engineer kept one hand over the receiver. No one spoke. Even the gentle hum of the studio equipment suddenly seemed louder than before. Johnny Cash looked toward the control room with an expression that only those who knew him well had ever seen. Not fear, not panic, something heavier. Recognition. He slowly walked across the room. Each step echoed through the studio until he reached the telephone. The engineer silently handed him the receiver. Johnny lifted it to his ear. June? His voice was calm, too calm. Everyone watched without moving. Only Johnny could hear the trembling voice on the other end. After several long seconds, he quietly asked, "Is she breathing?" The question struck the room like thunder. Nobody knew who she was. Johnny listened carefully, his eyes closed. "I'll come." Another pause. "No." A faint smile crossed his face. "Don't let her worry." He gently returned the receiver to its cradle. For a long moment he simply stood there, his shoulders lowered, as if years had suddenly settled upon them. Elvis walked over first. "What happened?" Johnny looked toward the floor before answering. "My mother." The room remained silent. "She collapsed tonight." Willie Nelson slowly removed his hat. Charlie lowered his eyes. Johnny continued quietly, "The doctors don't know how much time she has." No one knew what to say. Sometimes there are no comforting words, only presence. Elvis rested a hand on Johnny's shoulder. "You need to go." Johnny nodded. "I do." Then he looked toward Thomas. "And yet," he glanced back at Elvis, "something tells me I'm supposed to stay for another few minutes." Thomas stepped backward. "I'm sorry." Everyone looked toward him. "I shouldn't have come." His voice cracked again. "If I hadn't interrupted—" Johnny immediately shook his head. "No." Thomas looked confused. Johnny walked closer. "You didn't interrupt anything." "You have family waiting." "I do." "You should leave." Johnny smiled gently. "My mother spent her entire life teaching me one thing." He looked around the room. "When someone is carrying pain heavier than yours," he paused, "you don't compare it. You help carry it." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve that." Johnny answered almost instantly, "Neither do I." Leonard Brooks quietly closed his notebook. For the first time in more than 20 years as a journalist, he realized he had not written a single sentence during the last hour. He looked toward Elvis. "I owe you an apology." Elvis smiled softly. "For what?" "I came here looking for proof." He glanced around the room. "I thought greatness could be measured." Another pause. "I was wrong." No one answered. Leonard continued, "I've spent my career judging voices." His eyes settled on Thomas. "But tonight," he swallowed, "I heard hearts instead." The words surprised even him. Johnny gave a small nod. "Now you're beginning to listen." Outside, the rain finally stopped. Water still dripped from the roof as the clouds slowly parted. A faint moonlight filtered through the studio windows. Inside, Elvis returned to the grand piano. He rested both hands on the keys. Still, he didn't play. Instead, he looked toward every person in the room. Willie, Johnny, Charlie, the engineers, the musicians, Leonard, finally, Thomas. "I've sung in front of thousands." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I've heard crowds so loud they shook the building." He smiled faintly. "But the hardest songs," he looked directly at Thomas, "are never sung for thousands. Only for one." Thomas lowered his head. "I don't know if I can hear it." Elvis answered, "You don't have to." Thomas looked up. "You only have to feel it." Willie quietly lifted his old Martin guitar. "Mind if I stay with you?" Elvis smiled. "I was hoping you would." Johnny reached for a nearby acoustic bass. Charlie moved closer to the microphone. Nobody discussed arrangements, nobody counted beats, no producer gave instructions. It wasn't a recording session anymore. It had become something far more important. A room full of musicians preparing to comfort one grieving soul. Before anyone played a note, Thomas suddenly spoke again. There was one thing. Everyone turned toward him. My wife asked me something before she died. His breathing became uneven. I never answered her. Elvis leaned forward. What did she ask? Thomas looked down at the faded photograph. She asked, his voice almost disappeared, whether I'd keep singing after she was gone. Silence. I told her yes. His hands began shaking, but I lied. A tear rolled down his face. I couldn't do it. I packed away every record. I closed the piano. I even stopped humming while I worked. He covered his face. I was afraid. Elvis quietly asked, Afraid of what? Thomas answered through tears, that if I started singing again, he struggled to breathe, I'd realize she wasn't singing beside me. Nobody in the room remained untouched. Several musicians quietly wiped away tears. Willie stared toward the ceiling. Johnny removed his glasses. Even Leonard Brooks looked away. Elvis slowly stood. He walked across the room until he stood directly in front of Thomas. Then he asked something unexpected. Would you do something for me? Thomas nodded uncertainly. If I can. When I begin singing, Elvis said, don't listen to me. Thomas looked confused. What? Listen for Margaret. The room froze. Elvis continued, because love like yours doesn't disappear. It changes where you hear it. Thomas's lips trembled. I don't know if I believe that. Elvis smiled. You don't have to. He gently placed the photograph back into Thomas's hand. Just keep your heart open. Leonard quietly whispered to Charlie, I've interviewed presidents. I've covered legends. I've stood backstage at the Grand Ole Opry dozens of times. Charlie smiled. And? Leonard shook his head slowly. I've never seen anything like this. Charlie looked toward Elvis. Neither have I. The studio lights were dimmed even further. Only a warm glow remained above the piano. The room seemed suspended outside of time. Elvis finally lowered his fingers onto the keys. One soft chord echoed through RCA Studio B. Then another. The familiar introduction to How Great Thou Art. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed loudly. Willie joined with quiet, delicate guitar chords. Johnny added only a few gentle bass notes. Nothing more. Nothing unnecessary. The music wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was simply making room for hope. Elvis closed his eyes. He drew one slow breath. The first words were about to leave his lips when an unexpected sound interrupted everything. Not a telephone, not the studio door. A quiet voice, old, weak, almost trembling. It came from Thomas, barely louder than a whisper. He had begun singing the opening line before Elvis could. The same opening line Margaret had sung every Sunday morning for more than 40 years. His voice cracked. He forgot half the words. He struggled to stay on key, but he kept singing. Elvis never interrupted. Neither did Johnny. Neither did Willie. Instead, they quietly lowered their instruments and listened. Because at that moment, the most important voice in the room wasn't Elvis Presley's. It belonged to a grieving husband who, for the first time since losing the love of his life, had found the courage to sing again. And before the final verse was over, Someone standing silently near the back of the studio began crying so uncontrollably that the entire room slowly turned to see who it was. What they saw next would change the course of the evening forever. The sound of quiet sobbing spread gently through the studio. No one moved. No one wanted to disturb the fragile moment that had somehow transformed an ordinary rehearsal into something sacred. Elvis slowly turned toward the back of the room. Standing beside the control room door was Leonard Brooks, the man whose sharp reviews had frightened performers for 2 decades, was no longer trying to hide his emotions. His notebook had slipped from his hands onto the hardwood floor. His glasses rested in one trembling hand while tears rolled freely down his face. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Leonard laughed softly through his tears. "I suppose," he wiped his eyes, "this would make a terrible newspaper article." A few gentle smiles appeared across the room. Charlie bent down, picked up Leonard's notebook, and handed it back to him. "You've filled hundreds of these." Leonard nodded. "Thousands." Charlie looked at the empty pages. "This one's still blank." Leonard stared at it for a long time. "I don't think words belong in it." Thomas had stopped singing, not because he had forgotten the hymn, because emotion had taken away his voice. He clutched Margaret's photograph tightly against his chest. "I heard her." His whisper barely reached the others. Nobody answered immediately. Thomas looked around the room. "I know how impossible that sounds." His breathing remained uneven. "But when we reached the second verse," he smiled through tears, "I could almost hear her singing beside me." Johnny Cash quietly walked toward him. "No." Thomas looked confused. Johnny gently shook his head. "You didn't almost hear her." He placed a hand over Thomas's shoulder. "You remembered her exactly the way love was meant to be remembered." Thomas closed his eyes. For the first time in 6 months, his memories no longer felt like chains. They felt like gifts. Elvis remained seated at the piano. His fingers still rested lightly on the keys. He hadn't finished the hymn. In truth, he had hardly sung at all. He looked toward Willie Nelson. Willie smiled knowingly. "You planned that." Elvis chuckled. "I hoped. You let him take the song. I never owned it." The words settled warmly over everyone listening. "I've always believed songs choose their voices." Elvis looked toward Thomas. "And tonight," he smiled, "it wasn't my turn." One of the recording engineers quietly cleared his throat. "Elvis?" Everyone looked toward him. "The tape machine is still running." Silence. None of them had realized someone had pressed the record button nearly an hour earlier. The engineer continued, "It captured everything. The conversations, the laughter, the silence, Thomas singing, everything." Willie looked toward Elvis. "So, what do we do with it?" The room waited. A recording like this could become one of the most talked-about releases in country and gospel music. Record executives would pay fortunes for something so intimate. Johnny smiled faintly. "They'll never hear it." The engineer blinked. "What?" Johnny repeated himself. "They'll never hear it." He looked toward Elvis. "Some moments don't belong on records." Elvis nodded without hesitation. "They belong to the people who lived them." No one argued. The engineer slowly walked to the tape machine. He carefully removed the reel. For a brief moment he held musical history in his hands. Then, without ceremony, he erased it. Not because it lacked value, because its value could never be measured. Some memories become priceless only because they are never sold. Leonard watched the tape disappear. Years earlier, he would have called the decision foolish. Now, he understood. He slowly approached Elvis. "I spent my whole career believing greatness needed witnesses." Elvis smiled. "And now?" Leonard looked around the quiet studio. "I think the greatest moments happen when nobody is trying to create one." Johnny laughed softly. "Now you're talking like a songwriter." Willie tipped his hat. "Careful, we may recruit you." Even Leonard laughed. It was a different laugh than before, lighter, freer. Thomas carefully folded Margaret's photograph. Instead of putting it back into his wallet, he slipped it into the breast pocket of his work shirt, directly over his heart. Elvis noticed. "You moved it." Thomas nodded. "I've carried her in my wallet for years." He smiled gently. "I think it's time I carried her somewhere closer." No one could find words worthy of the moment. Sometimes silence remained the greatest expression of respect. Johnny glanced toward the clock. "I really do have to go." Everyone remembered the phone call. His mother. Charlie quietly asked, "Do you want one of us to drive?" Johnny smiled. "No." He looked toward Elvis. "I've already been reminded what matters." He extended his hand. Elvis ignored it. Instead, he embraced his friend. Neither man said a word. They didn't need to. When they finally stepped apart, Johnny looked toward Thomas. "Promise me something." Thomas nodded. "What is it?" "When you get home," Johnny said, "play one record." Thomas smiled. "I will." "And next Sunday," Johnny continued, "sing." Thomas's eyes filled again. "I think Margaret would like that." Johnny grinned. "I don't think. I know." Willie gathered his old guitar. Before leaving, he walked over to Thomas. "You ever write songs?" Thomas laughed. "I fix light fixtures." Willie smiled. "Sometimes that's the same thing." Thomas looked puzzled. Willie explained, "One repairs buildings. The other repairs people." He tipped his cowboy hat. "Both bring light." The studio slowly emptied. Musicians packed instruments. Microphone stands disappeared. Coffee cups were collected. One by one, everyone stepped into the cool Nashville night. Only Elvis remained inside. Charlie noticed. "You coming?" "In a minute." Charlie quietly left him alone. The studio became silent once more. Elvis walked toward the empty microphone standing beneath the soft overhead light. He stared at it for several moments. Then, with no audience, no applause, and no cameras, he finally sang the hymn from beginning to end. Just once. Only for himself, only for God. Only for every heart that had ever believed grief meant love was over. When the final note faded into the empty studio, he quietly whispered, "Thank you." No one heard him, or so he believed. As he turned to leave, he noticed the maintenance ladder still standing near the hallway. Thomas had forgotten it. Elvis smiled. Tomorrow, someone would return for the ladder. But tonight, Thomas had already repaired something far more important than a light. He had repaired hope. Epilogue. Several months later, Thomas returned to his small church just outside Nashville. The congregation was surprised to see him. For weeks after Margaret's passing, he had stayed away. That Sunday morning, the pastor invited the congregation to sing, "How Great Thou Art." Thomas stood slowly. His hands still trembled, but this time he sang every word. Not perfectly, not loudly, but with peace. After the service, a young widower approached him. I lost my wife last month. Thomas listened quietly. I don't know how to keep going. Thomas reached into his shirt pocket and touched Margaret's old photograph. Then he smiled the same gentle smile Elvis had worn that unforgettable night inside RCA Studio B. You don't stop loving them, he said softly. You simply learn to let your love become someone else's strength. Years later, no newspaper ever reported what happened in that recording studio. No record was released. No photographs surfaced. No headlines celebrated the evening. Yet everyone who had stood in that room carried it with them for the rest of their lives, because they discovered something that no chart, award, or standing ovation could ever teach. The greatest music is not the song that earns the loudest applause. It is the song that gives one broken heart the courage to sing again.